So I'm going to dive in. So as you guys have known, I've kind of had this theme, the knock life, recently because, I believe everybody has opportunities to just got to go knock the door and get it. And I used to have a team named Grit. And back my first year at Vivint, 2012, me and a guy named Nick Hansen co-managed a squad, and it was standing for GRIT, which is Grind, Relentless Improvement, and Teamwork. And we came up with this acronym. And, I want to kind of dive into this concept because I think the door-to-door world and the direct sales world is some of the most grittiest people. When Jordan Belfort came to speak at Door to Door Con a couple years ago, he was like, wow, like this brought me back to my roots. He used to sell meat door to door, and then he hustled in the stocks and stuff like that. But what's cool is a lot of people that see door-to-door people and know them for what they are, there's an element of like, oh, I couldn't do that. That would be way too hard for me. And when people say that, I almost kind of perk up and I'm like, yep, I am in a hard job and I am doing something that's tough and I am proud of how good I am at it and how hard I work at it and how much I've practiced at it. And there is an element of grit that you don't have that I do, and I'm willing to hustle for what I want to make. And so there's this element of, in James chapter 1 verse 22, it says, "Be ye doers of the word, not hearers only, deceiving your own selves." And so there's this element of false hustle that I don't want you to get trapped in. And when we get trapped in this like I'm working so hard, I'm doing the things, I'm saying the right things or whatever it is, and there's so many times where we're talkers and hearers and learners, and you're like, I watch all of Sam's videos, and I'm like, that's fantastic. But you don't do the work. And I was talking to a friend the other day because I'm out knocking a lot still. And I was like, man, it's so crazy to see how many people go through all of our stuff, get training, get support, earn a great opportunity, and just they don't knock. And I'm like, you're never going to get paid. I mean, it feels good to be part of the team. It feels good to be on the roster and have a jersey, but you don't get paid. And so there's a rep. This is a good quote. So it says, "Well done is more powerful than well said." I love that. And I had this friend of mine, Steve, where he talks like he makes millions of dollars. Like he's one of those guys where you're always around him, good friend, and he's always sitting there going, "Hey, I back in my day, I'd made 800 grand one year, and then I'm starting this business, and I'm starting this business, and I've got this thing on the side." And yet I'm like, cool. Every time I see you, you're available. Really productive people, they're not that available. Why? Because they're being productive. And, very rarely will I answer my call when you call me. And that's because I'm in a meeting. That's because I'm on the doors. That's because I'm doing something. And oftentimes, like a good litmus test is if people call you a lot and you're always available to answer the phone, this is probably a good indication you're not doing the work. And so, he would always play pickleball and basketball, and it's almost like you call him and he's like, "Oh yeah, I'll be right there," and I'm like, "How? Like I'm 3 weeks booked out." If you are like, "Hey, can we hang out?" I'm like, "Yeah, maybe in like October." And that's just my schedule. Like I love doing, and I love the grit, and I love the hard work. Do I like that fun? Heck yes, I like that fun. But the reality is I'm spending so much time doing the thing, not just visualizing the thing. I think there's an element of like manifestation that's so powerful in today's talk. But I'm like, manifestation that doesn't meet action is just a dream. And you've got to put the two together. So sometimes I don't know how to explain it. Like a productive or a really high achiever in business or sales, sometimes they get frustrated. And so I want you to ask yourself right now, if I'm around really high achieving people, do they get frustrated with how much I talk about being successful versus I'm just doing the actions? It's like when you're playing sports and there's somebody that's like, "Oh yeah, man, like I got you. Like, oh dude, I'm on a streak. I'm hot right now." Like, and then you're like, you haven't scored a bucket. Like you can't play defense. And I play a lot of basketball, and it's just like a lot of times there's just so much smack talk, and I'm like, cool. I don't know, my personality type, like the grit inside of me is like, you guys can talk all you want. Like I'm just gonna let my points do the talking, and If I'm losing, I'm going to shut my mouth and be like, cool, I'm losing and I own that. Or if I'm winning, I'm going to shut my mouth and just be like, yeah, I'm putting in work, like scoreboard. And the same thing applies. Is too often we get so emotionally attached in the talking of the smack talk that we forget that we're actually playing the game. And there's a principle, and this is for business leaders and business owners, and I call it death by business cards. And it's when you're printing out business, like you start a business and you're like, oh, I got to get business cards. I got to get a website. I got to get a logo. I got to get shirts. Well, oh my gosh, we're going to have this super cool marketing thing. My social media is going to look so good. And you get so obsessed with your own brand and your own logo and your own like your own image. And because you think those things are really important to be successful in business. And so any advice I give a business owner right out the gate, because I coach a lot of businesses, is I say, go get your first 10 deals and then you can make a website. Go get your first 10 deals and then I'll let you go get some business cards. And because I've seen, I bet you statistically, it's more often than not that people make business cards before they even make money, and then they never end up making money. So they have these useless business cards living in a drawer. I guarantee you that's actually really common. Or they spent $5,000 on a website or $500 on a website, whatever. And I'm like, nobody ever went to your website. And maybe you shared it with your mom and you're like, oh yeah, mom, check out my new company, check out my new website. And I'm like, cool, go get some deals. And that to me is grit. Like somebody that doesn't care about the website, they care about the deals. And eventually, I promise you'll make money and you can afford some websites and stuff like that. And so when I was 8, I'm gonna kind of weave in this story of grit. And I remember I was 8 years old, and this is really my first experience in sales. And I remember I'd go to my parents. My parents were well off, and they really liked the element of teaching me how to work. So ever since I was probably 4, it was spend 4 hours minimum on Saturday in the garden. And we lived in like 3 acres up in the mountains, so weeds were abundant. And we would spend literally 4 or 5 hours every Saturday. Before you could go watch cartoons, before you could go play with your friends, you ended up dirty as dirty and you just pulling weeds. And I hated pulling weeds. And so when I was 8, I was like, okay, I'm gonna make some money. And I never got allowance. You know, all my friends are getting like $20 a week or whatever the number was, $100. And I'm over here just like, oh, my rent payment to live here, my food payment is work hard on Saturday. And so I wanted my own money. And I go diving for golf balls. And I go find a bunch of golf balls. I get a big bin, I wash them all off, and I start selling golf balls at the golf course. And then the marshal was like, dude, you can't do this. And I was like, oh, okay, I didn't know. So what I did is I then was like, okay, the grit in me was like, all right, I'm going to go on the street where cars drive, but it's the cross between 2 holes where the carts have to cross across the street. And I was like, well, I'm on public property. Like, we can't tell me to like not sell lemonade and golf balls on the street. So I'm like, I was actually shocked that I was intuitive enough to think of that. And so then when on a busy day, I would go on busy days, and they would be stuck kind of waiting for the first group to go ahead of them. And so I then was like not getting a lot of people to stop. Like they just drive right past me, and I was like, screw that, they're stopping up there at the tee. So the grit inside of me was like, okay, I'll walk up there with my bin and some chips and some lemonade and I'll sell them. And they're awkwardly standing there. I'm like, hey, you guys obviously are thirsty, hungry, and you probably need some new balls. So would you guys be interested or whatever? Whatever my pitch was when I was 8. I'm sure it wasn't that smooth. But anyway, they would always buy. So I came home with almost $100 one day, and I remember my dad looking at me and he's like, what 8-year-old goes home, he goes and makes $100 in a day? Like, what is this? And I just remember like I was that willingness to go knock on the tee box and say, I will come to you. I'm not going to hope that you stop your golf cart in the middle of this drive, as I think was like a big lesson. And it always cemented into me, like, if you want something, go knock it. And the grit is going to survive. That cockroach is going to say, I will always be the survivor.